Today, I've got a story about 5 friends who thought they were taking a completely ordinary drive home after a basketball game. Instead, somewhere along the way, they turned away from home, drove deep into the mountains, abandoned a perfectly usable car in the snow, and walked into the darkness for reasons no one has ever been able to fully explain. Now, if you enjoy true stories that start out normal and then slowly become strange, unsettling, and almost impossible to make sense of, you're definitely in the right place. Around here, that's pretty much what we do. Before we get started, please invite the like button over for a nice warm cup of hot chocolate, wait until they've gotten really comfortable, and then casually mention that you replaced all the marshmallows with tiny frozen onions. Also, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next story. So let's get into it. It's a Friday night in February of 1978, and 5 friends from Northern California are heading out to watch a basketball game. Nothing reckless, nothing unusual. They're not going to some wild party. They're not sneaking away from their families, and they're definitely not planning an overnight trip. They're just 5 guys who love basketball. And the funny thing is, the game they're going to watch isn't even the one they're most excited about. Because the next morning, these 5 friends are supposed to play in a basketball tournament of their own. They've been talking about it for weeks. Their uniforms are ready. Their shoes are laid out. Some of their families have already helped them pack everything they'll need. This tournament is a big deal to them, and every person who knows these guys understands one thing very clearly. There is no way they would miss it on purpose. The 5 men are Ted Wire, Jack Madruga, Bill Sterling, Jackie Huet, and Gary Mathias. They live around Yuba City and Marysville, a quiet agricultural area north of Sacramento. They're all adults, ranging from their mid-20s to early 30s, but 4 of them have intellectual or developmental disabilities. They can work, take care of themselves, and go places together, but unfamiliar situations can sometimes be difficult for them. Their families tend to keep a close eye on them, not because the men are helpless, but because routine matters. And these guys really like routine. Ted Wire is 32 years old. He's friendly, dependable, and especially close to his family. Bill Sterling is 29, quiet and gentle. Jackie Huet, the youngest at 24, is shy and tends to rely on the others when they're out together. Jack Madruga is 30. He served in the Army, and he owns the car they're using that night, a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego. Jack loves that car. He keeps it in good condition, drives it carefully, and almost never lets anyone else get behind the wheel. His family says he treats that Mercury like it's one of the most valuable things he owns. Then there's Gary Mathias. Gary is 25 and also an Army veteran, but his life has been more complicated than the others. After his military service, he was diagnosed with schizophrenia. During some of his earlier episodes, he experienced hallucinations and behaved unpredictably. There were times when his family genuinely struggled to keep him safe. But by February of 1978, Gary is doing much better. He takes his medication regularly. He has been stable for roughly 2 years. He has a job, he spends time with friends, and his family believes he's finally rebuilding his life. So when the 5 men leave home on Friday, February 24th, nobody has a bad feeling about it. Their plan is simple. They'll drive about 50 miles north to Chico, watch Chico State play a basketball game, grab something to eat, and then come straight home. They need to get some sleep because they have to leave early the next morning for their tournament in Sacramento. The drive to Chico goes exactly as planned. The 5 friends arrive at the gym, find their seats, and watch the game. People later remember seeing them there. They're laughing, cheering, and enjoying themselves. There's no argument, no confrontation. Nobody notices a stranger bothering them. They just look like 5 friends having a great night. When the game ends, they leave the gym and stop at a small market nearby. At around 10 o'clock, the store clerk sees the 5 men buying snacks, fruit pies, chocolate bars, soft drinks, and milk. They appear relaxed. Nobody looks frightened. Nobody seems injured. And there's nothing about their behavior that makes the clerk think they're in trouble. That store clerk becomes the last person known to have seen all 5 of them alive. From the market, getting home should be easy. They've made the trip before. They just need to get back on the main highway and drive south. If they leave Chico shortly after 10, they should be home a little after 11. Their families expect to hear the Mercury pulling into the driveway before midnight. But midnight comes, and the car doesn't appear. Then 1 o'clock passes. Then 2. At first, The families try not to panic. This is 1978, so nobody has a cell phone. Maybe the men stopped somewhere for food. Maybe the car got a flat tire. Maybe they stayed longer in Chico than expected. But as the night stretches into morning, those explanations begin to fall apart. Jack is extremely protective of his car. If it broke down, he would find a phone and call somebody. Ted always lets his family know where he is. Gary needs his medication, and all 5 men are supposed to be at that basketball tournament. When morning arrives and none of them show up, their families know immediately that something is wrong. The men would not simply forget about the tournament. They wouldn't decide at the last minute to go somewhere else. One of them had even placed his uniform beside his bed so it would be ready when he woke up. But that uniform is still sitting there. The 5 players never arrive. Their families contact law enforcement, and officers begin checking the obvious places. They search the road between Chico and Yuba City. They call hospitals. They ask about traffic accidents. They contact friends and relatives. Nothing. There's no wreck along the highway. No one has been admitted to a hospital. No witness remembers seeing Jack's Mercury after the men left Chico. It's as though the car drove out of that market parking lot and vanished. Then, 4 days later, authorities receive a report about an abandoned vehicle on a remote mountain road northeast of Oroville. And already, there's a problem. Because this location is nowhere near the men's route home. To reach it, they would have had to leave Chico and travel east instead of south. They would have driven away from their families, away from the tournament, and deeper into the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The road becomes narrower as it climbs. The pavement gives way to rougher terrain. Snow begins piling up along the sides. At night, the area is almost completely dark. There are no restaurants up there, no hotels, no basketball gyms. Nothing that would have interested these 5 men. And yet, when officers reach the abandoned vehicle, they find Jack Madruga's turquoise and white Mercury sitting in the snow. The doors are unlocked. The car is empty. And somewhere during what should have been a routine drive home, 5 friends turned away from everything familiar, drove more than an hour into the mountains, stopped on a freezing road in the middle of nowhere, and walked into the darkness. Now, the first thing the deputies notice is that the Mercury does not look like a car that has been abandoned after some terrible accident. There is no blood inside, no broken glass, no sign of a struggle. The car is sitting near a snowbank, and at first glance, it seems obvious what must have happened. Jack drove too far up the mountain, the tires lost, traction, and the 5 men got out to find help. That explanation would make sense. Except the closer investigators look, the less sense it makes. The Mercury still has gas in the tank. Its engine is not damaged. When officers later test it, the car starts. It does not appear to be hopelessly trapped, either. The snow around the tires suggests there may have been some spinning, but 5 adult men should at least have been able to try pushing it free. And Jack was not the kind of person who casually walked away from his car. Remember, he loved this Mercury. He took care of it. He drove slowly over rough roads because the exhaust system hung low, and he hated the idea of damaging it. Yet somehow, he had guided the car several miles along a rutted mountain road without badly scraping the underside. That means whoever was driving was being extremely careful. But it also raises a strange question. If Jack had enough control to bring the car this far without wrecking it, why did he suddenly decide that walking into the snow was safer than staying inside? The doors are unlocked. One window is partly open. The keys are gone. Inside, investigators find the ordinary remains of the men's evening. Maps, wrappers from the snacks they bought in Chico, and personal items they apparently expected to take home. There is no note, no explanation. Just an empty car in a place none of them had any reason to visit. The temperature in the mountains that night had dropped well below freezing. Snow covered the ground, and the men were dressed for a basketball game, not a winter trek. Some wore light jackets. At least one had shoes that were completely unsuitable for deep snow. So the search teams begin with the most obvious theory. The men must have left the car, walked a short distance, and become disoriented. Deputies, forest rangers, volunteers, aircraft, and tracking dogs search the surrounding area. They check ravines, cabins, logging roads, and snow-covered trails. But they find no bodies. They find no camp. They find no clear trail showing where 5 men went. And then investigators hear about another man who was on that same mountain road on the same night. His name is Joseph Shones. Shones had driven into the mountains to check the snow conditions before a family outing. But his car became stuck not far from where the Mercury was later found. While trying to free it, he began suffering severe chest pain. He believed he was having a heart attack. Unable to drive away, Shones climbed back into his vehicle and spent the night there, drifting in and out of consciousness. And sometime during the night, he says he saw headlights approaching through the darkness. According to Shones, a car stopped nearby. He could make out several people standing around it, including what appeared to be a woman holding a baby. Shones called out for help. The moment he did, the headlights went dark. The people stopped moving. No one came toward him. Later, he said he saw lights again, this time from what looked like flashlights moving through the trees. Once more, he yelled. And once more, the lights disappeared. By morning, Shones was in terrible condition. He eventually left his car and began walking down the mountain for help. Along the way, he passed a turquoise and white Mercury sitting empty in the snow. It was Jack Madruga's car. Now, Shones had been in pain, exhausted, and possibly slipping in and out of consciousness, so investigators could not be sure how much of his story was reliable. But if he really did see the 5 men that night, then they may not have been lost when they first got out of the car. They may have heard someone calling for help, and instead of answering him, they turned off the lights, moved away from the road, and disappeared into the forest. For the next several days, search crews work their way through the mountains, but the conditions are brutal. The snow is deep enough to hide roads, footprints, even entire sections of fencing. Helicopters circle overhead when the weather allows, while deputies, forest rangers, volunteers, and members of the men's families push through the trees on foot. Everyone is looking for something simple: a jacket caught on a branch, a shoe in the snow, a trail leading away from the Mercury. But the mountain gives them almost nothing. That is what makes the situation so hard to understand. 5 men should leave a large trail. They are not experienced hikers. They are wearing ordinary street clothes and moving through winter snow. Investigators expect to find evidence within a mile or 2 of the car. Instead, the men seem to have vanished. Their families refuse to believe they wandered away for no reason. They wonder whether someone frightened them off the road. Maybe another vehicle forced them to stop. Maybe Gary became confused and the others followed because they trusted him. But every theory hits the same problem. There is no sign of violence at the car. No blood. No bullet holes. No damaged doors. No evidence that a stranger was ever inside. More snow falls over the search area. Any footprints that may have existed disappear beneath fresh drifts, and several logging roads become impossible to reach. Eventually, the official search is scaled back. The families keep looking. They drive into the mountains whenever the weather permits. They post photographs, speak to reporters, and follow rumors and supposed sightings. Every late-night phone call feels like it could finally explain where the 5 friends went. But February becomes March. March becomes April. Then May. And there is still nothing. By then, most people quietly assume the men are dead. What nobody knows is whether they died near the car, were taken somewhere else, or are still hidden beneath the snow. Then, on June 4th, more than 3 months after the disappearance, a group of motorcyclists rides into the Plumas National Forest. The thaw has opened roads that were inaccessible all winter. About 19 miles from where the Mercury was found, the riders reach a remote Forest Service camp containing trailers and storage buildings used by forestry crews. One rider notices that a trailer window appears broken and goes closer. Inside, the air is still and heavy. There is a bed against the wall. On that bed is a human body wrapped in sheets and blankets. The man is so thin that, at first, he barely looks real. Authorities are called, and the body is identified as 32-year-old Ted Wire. Finding Ted is horrifying, but it seems to answer one major question. The 5 men must have left the Mercury and walked farther into the mountains. Somehow, at least Ted reached this trailer. Then investigators examine the body, and the discovery becomes much more disturbing. Ted's shoes are gone. His feet are badly frostbitten. His beard has grown long, and his body is severely emaciated. Before disappearing, Ted weighed close to 200 pounds. By the time he is found, he has lost somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds. That does not happen in one freezing night. It does not happen in 2 or 3 days. The condition of Ted's body suggests he may have remained alive inside that trailer for weeks, possibly for as long as 8 to 13 weeks. Think about what that means. While deputies were searching near the abandoned car, Ted may have been alive almost 20 miles away. While his family was putting up posters, he may have been lying in that bed, and someone may have been there with him. Ted's frostbitten feet would have made walking extremely difficult. The blankets around him appeared carefully arranged. Empty food cans nearby showed that someone had managed to open and eat them. One can had been opened with a military-style can opener, a tool that Jack Madruga or Gary Mathias, both Army veterans, might have known how to use. Then investigators find a pair of tennis shoes believed to belong to Gary. Ted's own shoes are missing. The obvious possibility is that Gary reached the trailer with Ted, removed his own shoes, put on Ted's larger pair, and later walked back into the snow. But Gary is not there. Neither are Jack, Bill, or Jackie. And then investigators discover something that turns Ted's slow death into one of the most baffling parts of the case. Because only a few feet from the bed where Ted starved, there was enough food to keep the men alive for months. But long before anyone found Ted Wire in that trailer, there was one witness who may have seen the 5 men on the mountain the very night they disappeared. His name was Joseph Shones. And the reason his story matters is that Shones was not simply someone who came forward days later claiming he had seen a suspicious car. He was actually stranded on the same remote road, in the same stretch of darkness, only a short distance from where Jack Madruga's Mercury would later be found. That evening, Shones had driven into the mountains to check the snow conditions ahead of a planned family trip. But the farther he climbed, the worse the conditions became. At some point, his Volkswagen became stuck in the snow. Shones got out and tried to free it, but while he was working around the car, now imagine being in that position. It is late at night. You are alone on an isolated mountain road. The temperature is below freezing. Your car cannot move, and every breath feels like something heavy is pressing down on your chest. There are no houses nearby, no open businesses, and no phone. So Shones crawled back inside his Volkswagen, turned on the heater when he could, and tried to stay conscious. For hours, he drifted in and out. Then, sometime during the night, he saw headlights coming up the road. At first, this must have felt like a miracle. Somebody else was there. Somebody could drive him down the mountain or at least go for help. Shones said the vehicle stopped near him. Through the darkness and blowing snow, he could make out several people standing around it. He believed he saw a group of men. He also thought he saw a woman holding a baby. Shones later admitted he was in severe pain and may not have been fully alert. But what happened next was even harder to explain. Shones opened his window and called out. He told the people he was sick. He begged them for help. And almost immediately, the lights went out. The figures seemed to stop moving. No one answered him. No one approached the Volkswagen. For a while, the road was dark again. Then Shones said he noticed flashlight beams farther away, moving among the trees or across the snow. He called out a second time. Again, the lights disappeared. Think about how unsettling that is. A man is trapped in a freezing car, possibly dying, and there are people close enough to hear him. But the moment he makes his presence known, they go silent and turn off their lights. If those people were Ted, Jack, Bill, Jackie, and Gary, why would they avoid him? Were they frightened? Did they think Shones was a threat? Was someone else on the road with them? Or was Shones so sick and disoriented that he misunderstood what he was seeing? There is no clean answer. At some point during the night, Shones also believed he saw another set of lights farther down the road. Some versions of his account describe what looked like a pickup truck behind the group. But the conditions were terrible, and he could never give investigators a description precise enough to identify another vehicle. By morning, the pain in his chest had not gone away. Shones finally decided that remaining in the Volkswagen was more dangerous than trying to walk. He left the car and began moving down the mountain on foot. He was weak, cold, and in obvious distress. But after walking several miles, he reached help and was taken to a hospital, where doctors confirmed that he had suffered a mild heart attack. So at least that part of his story was real. And during that walk down the road, Shones passed an unfamiliar car sitting in the snow. It was turquoise and white, a 1969 Mercury Montego. 4 days later, when authorities found Jack Madruga's abandoned Mercury in that same location, Shones realized it was the car he had seen. That placed him on the mountain during the critical hours. But it did not tell investigators exactly what he had witnessed. Maybe the 5 men were standing near the Mercury, uncertain about what to do. Maybe they heard Shones calling and became afraid. Maybe Gary was experiencing a psychiatric episode and persuaded the others that the voice in the darkness was dangerous. Or maybe the figures Shones saw had nothing to do with the missing men at all. Investigators could not dismiss him, but they could not build the case around him either. His testimony was a clue wrapped inside a medical emergency. And by the time anyone understood how important it might be, the mountain had already begun erasing the evidence. Search crews returned to the area around the Mercury and pushed outward in every direction. They followed the road. They searched the trees. They checked slopes, drainage ditches, ravines, cabins, and maintenance buildings. Tracking dogs were brought in, but deep snow and changing weather made it nearly impossible to hold a scent. Helicopters flew over the forest when visibility allowed, looking for movement, dark clothing, disturbed snow, or anything that did not belong in the white landscape. The families joined whenever they could. This was not a casual search for them. They knew exactly how poorly equipped the men had been. Ted, Jack, Bill, Jackie, and Gary had gone to Chico, dressed for an indoor basketball game. They had not packed sleeping bags, heavy winter coats, snow boots, tents, or survival gear. Some of them were wearing lightweight shoes. None had planned to spend even one night outside. And every hour that passed made survival less likely. Still, the families held on to hope because the absence of evidence seemed almost impossible. 5 adult men moving through snow should leave something behind. A footprint, a dropped wrapper, a glove, a piece of clothing caught on a branch, a place where they had rested. But the crews found nothing that could be confidently connected to them. The snow grew deeper as fresh storms crossed the mountains. Tracks vanished, roads closed. Areas that searchers had not yet reached became inaccessible. The Mercury remained the only solid point on the map. And even that point raised more questions than it answered. The car had not crashed. It had not run out of gas. It was not badly damaged. There was no blood inside, no sign of a fight, and no evidence that the men had been forced out. The car was a shelter. It blocked the wind. It contained seats, carpeting, and some protection from the cold. Even without running the engine continuously, staying near it would have made them easier to find. Yet all 5 men had left together. That detail bothered investigators. If one man panicked and wandered away, the others might have stayed behind. If Jack went for help, at least one friend could have remained with the car. But no one did. Whatever made them leave appears to have affected the entire group. And once they began walking, they did not simply step into the trees and stop nearby. As later discoveries would prove, at least some of them traveled an astonishing distance through deep snow. The official search continued for days, then weeks. Reports came in from people who thought they had seen one or more of the men at gas stations, restaurants, or in neighboring towns. Each sighting was checked. None led anywhere. Rumors spread that the men had run away. Their families rejected that immediately. They had left money, clothes, and personal belongings at home. They had made plans for the next morning. Gary had only a limited amount of medication. Ted was so attached to his routine that disappearing voluntarily made no sense. Others suggested foul play. Maybe someone had followed them from Chico. Maybe they had witnessed a crime. Maybe a stranger forced their car up the mountain. But again, there was no physical evidence of another person. By spring, the snow still covered much of the search area. The families kept returning to the mountains, staring at the endless trees and wondering whether their sons were only a few yards beyond the road, hidden beneath a drift no one had checked. Then the search slowed. Not because anyone stopped caring, but because there was nowhere obvious left to look. The mountain had swallowed 5 men without leaving a clear trail. And for more than 3 months, Joseph Shones remained the last person who may have seen them alive. A sick man alone in a frozen car, headlights in the darkness, figures standing in the snow, a voice calling for help. And then, one by one, every light going out. By the beginning of June, the mountain finally started giving back what it had hidden all winter. Snow that had buried roads, ditches, and entire sections of forest began shrinking into dirty patches beneath the trees. Creeks swelled with runoff, old tire tracks reappeared, and logging routes that had been impossible to reach in February slowly opened again. For the families of Ted, Jack, Bill, Jackie, and Gary, the thaw brought a strange kind of hope. Maybe somebody would find a jacket. Perhaps a boot would surface beside the road. At the very least, the melting snow might reveal where the 5 men had gone after leaving the Mercury. Nobody was prepared for what it actually revealed. On June 4th, 1978, more than 3 months after the disappearance, a group of motorcyclists rode deep into the Plumas National Forest. Their route carried them toward a remote Forest Service camp used by crews working in the area. Several trailers and storage buildings stood there, quiet and apparently empty. One of the riders approached a trailer. Inside, he saw a bed. Lying on that bed was a man. The body was wrapped in sheets and blankets, so thin and still that for a moment the scene hardly seemed real. Authorities were called, and when investigators entered the trailer, they quickly realized the dead man was one of the missing 5. It was Ted Wire. At first, that discovery seemed to offer a terrible but understandable explanation. Ted must have survived the walk from the Mercury, reached the shelter, and then died from exposure sometime soon afterward. Yet almost immediately, the condition of his body told a very different story. Ted had not died on the night he disappeared. He had not died the next morning. Instead, he appeared to have remained alive inside that trailer for a long time. Before vanishing, Ted weighed close to 200 pounds. By the time he was found, he had lost somewhere between 80 and 100 pounds. His face was sunken, his body severely wasted, and a thick beard had grown across his face. Medical examiners believed he had died from a combination of starvation and exposure. That alone was horrifying. What made it almost impossible to process was the possibility that Ted had survived for weeks, perhaps as long as 2 or even 3 months. Just think about the timing. While deputies were searching around the abandoned Mercury, Ted may have been alive nearly 20 miles away. As his family handed out photographs and called hospitals, he may have been lying in that trailer, waiting for someone to come through the door. During the weeks when storms forced search teams off the mountain, he may still have been breathing. No one knew whether he was conscious the entire time or whether frostbite, weakness, and hunger had left him drifting in and out. Still, the evidence made one thing clear: his death had not been quick. Ted's feet were badly frostbitten. His shoes were missing. Multiple sheets and blankets had been wrapped around him, and their placement made investigators wonder whether someone else had covered him. A man in Ted's condition might have struggled to arrange everything so carefully, especially once his feet became unusable. That raised a chilling possibility. Ted may not have reached the trailer alone. Someone may have helped him inside. Whoever stayed with Ted may have placed him on the bed. That same person may even have cared for him for a while before leaving. Near the bed, investigators found personal items, empty food cans, and other signs that at least one person had tried to survive there. The trailer had not simply been stumbled into and abandoned after a single night. People had stayed. Exactly how many people and for how long was impossible to say. The distance from the Mercury made the discovery even stranger. Ted had been found roughly 19 miles from the car. That is a long walk under normal conditions. In February, with deep snow, freezing temperatures, darkness, and no proper winter clothing, it would have been punishing. The men would have needed to follow the mountain road for hours, perhaps through the entire night and into the next day. None of them had prepared for that. They had no sleeping bags. No tents had been packed. Their clothes were meant for a gymnasium and a drive home, not a journey through the Sierra Nevada in winter. Somehow, however, at least Ted made it all the way to the Forest Service camp. Investigators now had a route. Searchers began working backward from the trailer toward the abandoned Mercury, looking carefully along the road that connected them. With the snow finally retreating, the forest began revealing evidence that had been invisible for months. Not far from the route, they found human remains. One set belonged to Jack Madruga, another belonged to Bill Sterling. Both men had apparently made it many miles from the car before collapsing. Their remains were found roughly 11 miles from the Mercury, still several miles short of the trailer where Ted had been discovered. Animals and weather had badly disturbed the bodies, making the exact sequence of events difficult to reconstruct. Even so, the location suggested that Jack and Bill had been traveling in the same general direction as Ted. Maybe the 5 men had stayed together at first. Perhaps exhaustion began separating them as the night continued. Jack and Bill may have become too weak to keep moving, while Ted and at least one other friend pushed farther up the road. Nobody could tell whether the men had argued, chosen different paths, or simply lost sight of one another in the dark. A few days later, Jackie Huette's father joined the search near the Forest Service camp. For months, he had lived with the same terrible uncertainty as the other families. Every day had left room for hope because no body had been found. Now that Ted, Jack, and Bill had been identified, that hope was narrowing fast. While searching the area, Jackie's father discovered remains and personal effects that appeared to belong to his son. Further examination confirmed that Jackie had also died in the mountains. 4 of the 5 friends had now been found. Jack and Bill had fallen somewhere along the long road from the Mercury. Jackie's remains were located closer to the camp. Ted had reached the trailer and stayed alive far longer than anyone expected. Only Gary Mathias was still missing. At that point, investigators tried to imagine what the journey must have looked like. 5 men leave an operable car on a freezing road. Together, they begin walking deeper into the mountains instead of heading downhill toward help. Miles pass. The cold worsens. Shoes become soaked. Feet begin losing sensation. 1 or more men fall behind. Still, somebody keeps moving until the Forest Service camp finally appears through the trees. That camp should have been their salvation. The trailer gave them walls, a roof, beds, blankets, and protection from the wind. Even reaching it was an incredible piece of luck. Had they stopped almost anywhere else, Ted likely would have died much sooner. Instead, the shelter prolonged his life. But it did not save him. Now investigators turned back to the trailer and tried to read the room as if it were a record of the final weeks. Several ration cans had been opened. Food had clearly been eaten there. Blankets and sheets had been placed around Ted, not thrown randomly across him. Small details suggested that somebody had moved through the shelter, made choices, and tried to keep at least one injured man alive. Those signs mattered because Ted's feet were so badly frostbitten that walking would eventually have become nearly impossible. Once he reached the bed, he may have depended completely on another person for food, water, and warmth. Whoever helped him was gone. Maybe Jackie had been there before dying somewhere outside. Perhaps Gary stayed longer and then left to search for help. Jack or Bill could even have reached the camp before trying to walk back down the road. None of those possibilities could be confirmed. The trailer contained no diary, no message scratched onto a wall, and no final note naming the person who had stayed beside Ted. Nothing explained why anyone would abandon a living friend who could no longer walk. Still, investigators now knew the disappearance had unfolded in stages. The men did not all die beside the Mercury. They did not collapse together during the first night. At least some of them traveled nearly 20 miles, found shelter, opened food, and remained alive long enough to settle into a grim routine. That realization changed the entire case. Up to this point, the mountain itself had seemed like the obvious killer. 5 poorly equipped men had entered deep snow, become lost, and died from exposure. Ted's body showed something more complicated. He had beaten the first night. The trailer had protected him from the wind. Somebody had found a way to feed him. Days passed, then likely weeks, while the outside world searched in the wrong place. Yet rescue never came. As officers photographed the room, others began checking the remaining buildings at the camp. They opened cupboards, looked through storage areas, and searched for anything that might explain how long the men had survived. At first, the empty cans near Ted seemed to provide the answer. The men had found a limited amount of food. They had eaten it. Eventually, it ran out. That would have been awful, but it would also have been understandable. Then an investigator opened one of the camp's storage lockers. Inside was more food. A great deal more. Additional supplies were found nearby, along with equipment that could have made the trailer warmer and safer. Much of it appeared never to have been used. For a moment, the whole theory collapsed. Ted had not simply reached an empty shelter and waited for death. He had spent weeks wasting away in a place containing the very things that might have saved him. 4 friends were now confirmed dead. Gary Mathias was still missing. And inside that quiet trailer, investigators had just discovered that the most difficult question was no longer why the men walked into the mountains. It was why, after at least one of them reached safety, they still could not survive. Here is the part that turns this case from a tragic survival story into something almost impossible to explain. Ted Wire did not die in an empty shelter with nothing around him. Within the Forest Service camp were enough supplies to give the men a real chance of surviving until spring. Investigators found military-style rations, canned food, dried provisions, blankets, matches, and equipment that could provide heat. Nearby storage held so much food that officials believed it might have sustained all 5 men for months. Yet most of it had never been touched. Several ration cans had been opened, proving that whoever reached the camp knew food was available. One can appear to have been opened with a small military-style opener, the kind Gary Mathias or Jack Madruga might have recognized from Army service. Still, the men consumed only a small portion of what was there. Nobody carried the larger stores beside Ted's bed. No one appeared to organize the supplies, ration them, or prepare for a long stay. Even stranger, the trailer had a heating system connected to a propane supply. Cold had already destroyed Ted's feet. Temperatures outside remained dangerous for weeks, and warmth could have changed everything. But investigators found no indication that the heater had been used. Imagine standing inside that shelter, knowing your friend can barely move because his feet are frozen, and never turning on the one device that could warm the room. Why would anyone do that? One possibility was that the men simply did not understand how the system worked. 4 of the friends had intellectual or developmental disabilities, and in a crisis, confusion could make even a simple task overwhelming. Families also described the men as respectful of rules and other people's property. Some investigators wondered whether they avoided supplies marked for Forest Service use because they believed taking them was forbidden. At first, that explanation sounds reasonable. Then you remember that someone had already entered the trailer through a broken window. Food cans had been opened. Sheets and blankets had been used. Survival had already forced them to cross several boundaries, so why stop before reaching the things that mattered most? Another possibility is that Ted was not alone, but the person caring for him never understood how much help was available. Maybe Jackie reached the camp briefly. Perhaps Gary remained beside Ted, opening a few rations at a time and assuming the rest of the food was inaccessible. However, the room offered no clear answer about who had been there. What investigators did find was a pair of tennis shoes believed to belong to Gary Mathias. Ted's own shoes were missing. That small exchange created one of the strongest theories about Gary's final movements. Gary may have reached the trailer with Ted and removed his wet sneakers. Ted's shoes were larger and possibly easier to wear after swollen, frostbitten feet made Gary's pair painful. At some point, he may have put on Ted's shoes, covered his friend with blankets, and walked out to find help. If that happened, Gary may have been the last member of the group still capable of moving. Instead of finding help, though, he disappeared. Search teams combed the camp, nearby roads, gullies, streams, and wooded slopes. No confirmed remains of Gary were ever found. A body can vanish surprisingly well in wilderness like that. Animals scatter bones. Spring runoff carries smaller remains into ravines. Dense vegetation can hide something only a few feet from a trail. Even so, 4 men were eventually located, while Gary alone seemed to dissolve into the mountain. That absence led some people to wonder whether he survived. Maybe Gary reached a road and left the area. Possibly he suffered another psychiatric crisis and chose not to return home. Occasional sightings were reported, but none was verified. His family never received a reliable call or letter, and he had left without the medication that helped keep him stable. But even if Gary died after leaving Ted, that explains only the end of the story. It does not explain the beginning. Why were the 5 men on that road at all? The simplest theory says they became lost after the basketball game. Maybe Jack missed a turn, followed the wrong highway, and continued because he believed the road would reconnect with a familiar route. Yet this was not a small navigation error. The Mercury traveled away from home and climbed deep into the mountains. Jack was cautious, protective of his car, and reportedly uncomfortable on unfamiliar back roads. Continuing mile after mile into snow gave him repeated opportunities to turn around. Something kept them moving. A second theory centers on Gary. Because he had schizophrenia, some have suggested he experienced a psychotic episode, became convinced they needed to enter the mountains, and persuaded the others to follow him. However, no evidence showed that he was unstable that night. Witnesses at the game and market noticed nothing unusual. His family said he had taken his medication and remained stable for about 2 years. Blaming him simply because of his diagnosis turns a complicated case into an easy story unsupported by proof. Besides, even an episode would not fully explain who drove the Mercury so carefully up the rough road, why all 5 left the car, or why nobody returned once the danger became obvious. A third theory is that they were frightened by someone. Maybe another driver followed them from Chico. Perhaps they encountered trouble on the highway and turned toward the mountains trying to escape. Joseph Shones' account leaves room for this possibility. He thought he saw several figures, another vehicle, and lights that vanished whenever he called out. If someone else was present, the men may have left the Mercury because remaining near it felt dangerous. The problem is that the car showed no evidence of an attack. There were no bullet holes, bloodstains, or signs of forced entry. Nobody reported an argument at the game or market. No suspect ever emerged. Still, fear does not always leave physical evidence. A threat can be spoken. Weapons can be shown without being fired. Someone can be followed without touching the other car. That theory gives the 5 men a reason to choose a freezing forest over a usable automobile. But it creates another question. Where did the threatening person go? The men's path after leaving the Mercury appears to have followed the road toward the Forest Service camp. Their bodies were found along that general route, not scattered as though they were fleeing blindly through the trees. This looks less like a frantic escape and more like a deliberate walk towards something they believed was ahead. Maybe they saw tracks in the snow. Possibly they knew a camp existed farther up the road. Alternatively, distant lights may have convinced them help was close. What they could not have understood was the distance. 19 miles in deep snow can feel endless. Darkness, exhaustion, and hypothermia gradually damage judgment. A person suffering from cold can become confused, misjudge danger, or continue walking when stopping would be wiser. Jack and Bill may have collapsed first. Jackie could have reached the camp and later wandered outside. Ted became trapped in bed by frostbite and weakness. Gary may have stayed until hunger, fear, or desperation drove him back into the snow. That sequence is possible. It is also only a reconstruction. No witness saw them leave the Mercury. Nobody heard their conversations on the road. Not one of the men left a written explanation. Over the years, every theory has solved one piece while breaking another. A wrong turn explains how they entered the mountains, but not why Jack kept going. Being stuck explains why they got out, but not why they abandoned shelter when the vehicle could still run. Gary's illness offers a possible source of confusion, but there is no evidence of an episode. A pursuing stranger explains their fear, but leaves no suspect and almost no trace. The trailer explains how Ted survived so long, but creates the food and heating mysteries. Gary leaving for help explains the missing shoes, yet his destination and remains remain unknown. Eventually, you realize this case is not built around one impossible event. It is built around a chain of decisions that each seems slightly wrong. First, the 5 men drove away from home. Next, they continued climbing when the road became dangerous. Then, every one of them left the car. Afterward, they walked for miles instead of turning back. Finally, at least some reached a place with shelter, food, and heat, yet still failed to use enough of it to survive. Any single choice might be explained by fear, confusion, cold, or bad luck. Together, they form a story that has resisted every neat answer for decades. 4 families eventually buried their sons. Gary Mathias's family never received even that final certainty. His photograph remained attached to the case as the one face without a body, the one person who might have known what happened after the group entered the snow. Perhaps Gary died near the trailer, hidden beneath brush that searchers walked past. Maybe he traveled much farther than anyone believed possible. Or, however unlikely, he reached another road and carried the answer away with him. What remains certain is painfully simple. 5 friends left Chico happy, calm, and focused on a basketball tournament the following morning. None had planned to visit the mountains. Nothing at the market suggested danger. Their car still worked. Safety, food, and warmth were all within reach at different points in the night. Yet by the time the snow melted, 4 were dead and 1 had vanished. So the mystery is not really how people can die in a winter wilderness. We already know the cold can do that. The mystery is what happened during that quiet drive home. What they saw, heard, feared, or believed. That made all 5 of them turn away from the highway, climb into the snow, and keep going until there was no road left to bring them back. If you have a theory about what happened that night, I'd genuinely love to hear it, so leave it down in the comments. And if you're looking for another true story you never expected, there's a whole playlist waiting for you right here. Pick one, get comfortable, and I'll meet you over there. Thanks so much for spending some time with me today. Until next time, take care of yourself, and I'll see you in the next story.